Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break with Paolo. I'm Paolo von Schirach, your host and president of the Global Policy Institute at Washington, D.C. think tank. This podcast is brought to you by Bay Atlantic University, located in downtown Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks from the White House. This series is produced by Switch and Board, also located in Washington, D.C. Today, we're talking about energy. While this may sound obvious to most of you, let me just emphasize, energy is essential. In our modern economy, energy is just as important as oxygen is for all of us. Simply stated, no energy, no nothing. No electricity, no gasoline, no cars, no trucks, no trains, no airplanes, no factories, no computers, no home appliances, no phones. Think of that for a moment. That said, the energy universe has become more complex. We have fossil fuels, renewable energy, and now the concerns about global warming and the connections between burning fossil fuels and increased emissions of heat-trapping gases, hence warming of the atmosphere and everything that follows. To discuss all this, we're very fortunate to have with us Lou Pugliaresi, a real energy expert. Lou has been studying all this and a lot more for quite a long time. Lou is currently president of the Energy Policy Research Foundation based here in Washington, D.C. In the course of a distinguished career, Lou held numerous high-level government positions. He testified many times before Congress and authored many studies on energy. Welcome, Lou.
It's good to be here. Thank you, Paolo.
Okay, why don't we start from let's do a little bit of a tour d'horizon here. Let's look at the American energy scene, which has, if 15 years ago, people would have said, oh, America is going to be the largest oil and gas producer in the world, they would say, what are you smoking, right? You're crazy.
Exactly.
This is not possible.
Yeah, so it might be useful to just go through a little background here. Actually, the phenomena of geologists being wrong is not new. Actually, at the turn of the century, the U.S. Geological Survey said there was no oil in Texas, and they were convinced that was true. And so the U.S. has had this very interesting history, at least in the petroleum industry, petroleum sector, in which our production grew dramatically through World War II, way up until actually the early 70s. And then we began a long-term decline, actually. We have the Arab oil embargo in the mid-70s, 73, 74. One can argue whether that was truly an effective embargo, but more a reflection that oil production out of the Middle East was going to be handled by governments instead of private sector. And we had a massive program in the U.S., people forget, to deal with energy security. I mean, actually petroleum imports. We were importing well over 60, 70% of our requirements. We built a very big strategic petroleum reserve.
Which we still have today.
Which we still have today. We put it, it's a bit smaller. In the Kissinger era, we formed an alliance with our OECD partners and formed the International Energy Agency.
Based in Paris.
Yes, collective response to a major supply disruption. And then around 2006 or 7, some folks like Mr. Mitchell and largely wildcatters, what we call good old boys, independent drillers in Texas, started experimenting with something called hydraulic fracturing. And by the way, hydraulic fracturing has been around since the 50s. Vertical wells were often treated with a hydraulic fracturing, which is putting a lot of water under pressure to open up very small fissures in the rock. And if you saw a piece of shale rock, which this hydraulic fracturing, we call the unconventional resources, or shale rock, if you saw it in front of the table here, it looks like a piece of granite. It's hard. You just can't believe that anyone can get any oil out of it. I say around 2006 or 7, and I think the expectations in the U.S., you have to understand, expectations in the U.S. that we were on a long-term decline, that we were addicted to oil. We passed a lot of bad legislation, some kind of medium helpful. One of the reasons we have a mandate for the use of renewable fuels in the U.S. is because under the Bush administration, as you remember, we were addicted to oil. So we've got a lot of legislation, which we don't have time to talk about now, but which had counterproductive impacts. But the U.S. had a unique thing going on. We had private mineral rights. This is actually unheard of in the world. But in large parts of the United States, land which was not settled originally through the Homestead Act or act in which the federal government, the public lands, retained the mineral rights, but which there were privately held lands. If you think about Texas, it was an independent country when it came into the Union. Virtually all the land in Texas is privately held. Small amounts owned by the state of Texas, almost none by the federal government. That would actually happened to be the case in North Dakota as well. And of course, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma also had wide swaths of private mineral rights. And it was those private mineral rights that provided an incentive for drillers, entrepreneurs.
Because basically people have skin in the game. Basically.
Yeah, they had skin in
that
the
really,
game.
just to explain to our audience,
Yeah.
that really means that if you own the land, you also own the mineral rights.
Exactly.
Is that correct? That's the way,
Exactly, yeah.
simple way of putting it.
But
Yes.
we also have public lands in the U.S., and we'll talk about that in a minute. So I think largely with Mr. Mitchell and his company, they began to experiment with horizontal drilling, and they figured out that if they could marry technology, which was getting better all the time.
So fracturing and horizontal drilling.
And so if they could provide a horizontal pathway, and things like the ability of directional drilling, advances in GPS, all these things came together to help drillers figure out, okay, where do I put this long pipe it's maybe 10,000 feet below the surface of the earth. Where do I put it? Where do I direct it? How can I use that pipe then to put water under high pressure to open up this rock and then let oil flow to the surface? So this was the use of hydraulic fracturing in a horizontal format. That was what the unique application was.
That was the innovation.
That was the
Which
innovation.
brought about the fracking revolution.
Yes, it brought about what they call the fracking. I think if you talk to most people who say, I don't like fracking, I want to ban fracking, they really don't know what it is. What they really don't want is all the industrial activity surrounding it. The trucks on the road, the water trucks, the recycling of the water, the pressure on the municipal sewage systems, all these kinds of things which have been worked out in different ways. But this is really a revolution because the U.S. went from a massive net importer, 60, 70% of our oil, to today in which the North American production platform, U.S., Canada, and the U.S. together are now net exporters to the world market.
Yeah. In a span of just a few years.
Span of a few years, I would say from the beginning of this is 2008 to 2010, and here we're only 2019.
So can we say that then from a variety of standpoints, obviously our balance of trade, right? Whatever we don't get at home, we don't have to buy from OPEC and other assorted sellers. So that's a good thing. It is energy security. We're a superpower. We better be, if we rely on our own energy supply, it's better than relying on far-flung places.
Yeah, so I would say the energy security problem would be best described as, in the past anyway, as a concentration of low-cost reserves in unstable parts of the world.
Yeah.
And that concentration of low-cost reserve posed two security risks to the U.S. One, a group of producers could constrain output and charge much higher prices than would prevail in a more competitive market in extracting wealth from the U.S., or either by design or by external forces, some of these producers could go out of business, spike the price of oil, and do enormous damage to not just the U.S., but the Western economies dependent upon petroleum. So the one big shift is clearly the wealth transfer has ended. Right?
Yeah.
The wealth transfer is actually going the other way. The U.S. now
Becoming
is,
exporters.
I'll give you a good example of this. There was recently a sale in New Mexico on public land, right? That's where the government manages the lease terms and everything and collects the money. The sum of the high bids, this was last December in 2018 in New Mexico, by the way, which has a Democratic legislature, which is opposed to fracking and has a bill to end all fracking. The sum of the high bids on these federal lands was $1 billion. But what I think a lot of people would be surprised is that under the U.S. law, the state of New Mexico received a large percentage of this. In fact, almost 50%. And I have a photograph of relatively low-level interior officials presenting a check for $489 million to county and state officials in New Mexico. And I would like to note that nobody in New Mexico has suggested they return the funds. And by the way, if you think about this pure wealth in a way, it allows them to build roads, schools, hospitals.
Basically goes to general revenue.
Yes, $489 million is a lot of money.
For New Mexico, which is
Yes,
a rather
right.
small state,
Yes.
yes. Well, that's great stuff. So,
Yep.
so let's say that we have a complete transformation, right? Both in oil and gas, which we sometimes we forget,
Yes, right.
because gas now has become, I guess, because of its cost and also because it pollutes a lot less, is gradually replacing, at least in part, coal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact,
for power generation.
in the U.S., contrary to what a lot of political people say, neither President Obama or President Trump had much to do with the power sector. Coal has largely been, let's say, declining or defeated, if you like, by cheap natural gas. In fact, the U.S. today is the largest oil and natural gas producer in the world.
That's okay. So, which means that there is while this was not the objective, there is an environmental gain
There is an environmental gain.
in this process, which is really driven by economics.
Over the last 12, although we had a bump last year, over the last 12 years, the U.S. has had the largest reduction in emissions of heat trapping, carbon dioxide. And
largely
methane.
because of the transition away from coal into natural gas.
Almost entirely from the transition of more gas into coal, and also a shift in the structure of the national economy.
Let's look a little bit further now, and then we can talk about renewables and other factors affecting the scenario. Let's talk about export markets, right? You were mentioning before LNG, right? Maybe we can explain a little bit what that is.
Sure.
And the fact is that now the United States, because of terminals that have been completed and other facilities that allow the exporting of natural gas, is now a significant new supplier to not just obviously the domestic market, but the world markets, whether it's Asia, which, Japan or Korea, they don't have any energy at home, they have to buy it. And of course, Europe, which is a more complex situation because it's largely supplied by Russia and Middle East a little bit here and there. So tell us what is LNG and why is it a factor now that the United States is becoming a player in the LNG market?
Natural gas has a lot of uses in the way it's produced. Most people may not realize that when you produce natural gas in the U.S., you actually have to take a lot of liquids out of it, things like propane, butane. These are elements that can be used in the production of gasoline and fuels. We also can take out ethane, which is very important for the production of plastics. Now, the U.S., I would say between about 2000 and 2006, had massive plans to import LNG. Now, LNG is natural gas, which is compressed, essentially turned into a liquid to allow its transport
By sea.
by refrigerated tankers over long distances. And the LNG itself has been around for a long time. Actually, the U.S., over 30 years ago, exported LNG out of Kitimat, Alaska, to Japan. It wasn't a huge project, and the LNG market has traditionally been dominated by the Qataris, Australians, the Algerians, and Trinidad and Tobago. So LNG has been around a long time, and it was in the Pacific is dominated by only 3 big consumers: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And the entrance of the U.S. into this market, we took facilities that were made to import LNG, turned them around, added liquefaction capacity in those. And I think that couple of interesting things is the U.S. has gone in a very short time from, I would say in the last 5 years, from a non-existent player in the world market to today almost 25% of the world market is supplied by U.S. LNG.
Even though we still have a lot of terminals that haven't quite come
We still have
online,
a
right?
lot more to come online.
So we have more additional capacity.
Yes, we think within about 5 years, the U.S. can have anywhere from 35 to 40% of the world market.
Let's talk about Europe for a moment, and I know
Yeah.
this is because this has been very contentious politically because of the geopolitics involved, and we know, of course, historically, Europe has depended largely on natural gas imports first from the Soviet Union, and now Russia, through pipelines, right? And some, of course, the dependence varies from country to country. But it's overall, I think, is about the average is about 30%.
Yes, and
In some cases, much, much higher. But
and I think the interesting thing about Europe is that even in the power sector, and if you look at the European market, it's not going to grow. Its net demand for natural gas or power, if it grows, it's very small. And so mostly what you have in Europe is the loss of domestic production, the Groningen field and off of Holland, some lower production coming out of Norway, although they're doing some improvements there. And the Europeans have historically imported by pipeline.
yes,
A lot of gas outside of Russia, up through Algeria.
through across the Mediterranean.
Right,
yes.
right. So I think part of this debate on whether the Europeans should buy, quote, more gas from the Russians goes back to the era of when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and Jimmy Carter put an embargo on the shipment of U.S. equipment to dig, Caterpillar equipment, which would dig trenches to allow pipelines or place pipelines, a lot of technology, as a sort of response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But what a lot of people don't know is the European dependence on gas came out of an era in which everyone was concerned about European dependence on liquid fuels from OPEC. And so a lot of the shift to gas in Europe was actually initiated or through cooperative efforts with the U.S. after the IEA was formed to reduce its dependence on OPEC. Now, there were a lot of other good reasons to do that, too. You don't want to produce electricity from crude oil or heavy fuel oil.
Yeah.
This was a very common thing. People forget
Before,
in the 50s and the 60s, right?
But so now, here's this, tell us what's going on, because what we see now is that the United States is becoming a player, right, in the supply of Europe. Of course, everybody says, oh, but LNG is more expensive than piped gas because of the cost of liquefying it, transporting and regasifying, etc. It looks like those prices are going down a little bit.
Yeah,
Tell us what's and therefore it's becoming competitive.
Yeah, so I think right now, and over the next year or two, these prices that you're seeing, they're not providing a return on capital. Now, capital costs can come down. We've seen some very interesting work on this, but we have a kind of glut in LNG in the world market. We do not think it's a long-term issue. And I think the other issue for the Europeans are how integrated is their pipeline network? And except for some Eastern European players, I think the evidence suggests they're pretty well integrated into the world oil market, and the leverage Gazprom has, or the Russians have, is limited or not as, let's say, not as powerful as a lot of American sort of political analysts would, political people and analysts would think. In other words, I'm not too concerned about the energy security aspects of a new pipeline from Russia. I'm more concerned that why are they doing business with these guys?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, of course, we know, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, that the very fact that America is now a player as a sort of an alternate supplier has forced Gazprom to give discounts
Yes.
to its customers.
And I
in
think
Europe.
from any kind of portfolio strategy, European companies look at the market and say, look, I don't want to be reliant on one person. I think the Europeans have done a good job of integrating their pipeline. They might not have as kind of a competitive gas market as the U.S., but it's a pretty competitive market. It's pretty integrated. If someone tries to use leverage, it's easy to find an alternative supplier. We have a lot of transparency in pricing and transactions We have financial markets and ways to hedge. But true, I mean, there is a kind of political dimension to buying more gas from Russia that can't be ignored.
Okay, I mean, so we get the picture. America, from being in the decline, a declining producer that had to rely heavily on imports, now reversed the scenario entirely in a very short period of time, thanks to really old Yankee ingenuity, right? This is not a government program,
Exactly.
right? This
exactly.
is not.
So there's some claims that DOE did provide some research support over the years for fracking, and I suspect it was helpful, right?
Yes.
But I don't.
But
But it would not have been possible without
Mr. Mitchell and his.
right. And private property had a big.
Yes.
And I'll tell you the one interesting thing about the private thing. I've actually saw this in an oil field in the Permian Basin. I just happened to be on site talking to some
In
folks
Texas.
in Texas, and a geologist and something called a landman. Now, a landman in the oil business is the guy that goes and finds the person that owns the resource and makes the deal. And a vice president of an independent drilling company, the landman, the geologist were looking at some recent production trends on a field they were working on. And the landman said, he was a trained geologist, said, that looks like something I saw up in Pennsylvania. And it's sort of a region in Pennsylvania, close to the Marcellus. And the vice president looked at him and said, you should leave this afternoon on an airplane to talk to that man. Okay. They sent him out right away to see if he could make a deal. So, and I want to contrast that with the federal leasing. The federal leasing system is a long process. It requires nominating tracts, doing environmental impact statements, having public reviews, posting things, and can take up to 2 to 3 years to hold a lease sale. Think about this.
Yeah. Just one, before I want to talk about renewables now and how, and compare and contrast, but one important point that has been said a lot, and many people have seem to be trapped in this belief. They say, oh, fracking is bad. You turn the tap and gas comes and it explodes and there is earthquakes and you contaminate the water table and on and on and on. There are some negatives, right? We know that. In particular, I would say as a layperson, is the very large consumption of water that is used for fracking. Tell us what's real and what's hype.
So any industrial activity which requires you to remove earth, move supplies around, can be disruptive. Okay? I don't care whether it's a steel mill. So you have to always decide how best to incorporate that within the broader sort of the national economy or the state or the local community. Now, fracking on the whole has been studied extensively by the Environmental Protection Agency in the Obama administration. And their conclusion was that on the basic point of does fracking result in the migration of natural gas or other pollutants into the aquifer or into the water table. And because fracking takes place so far below
the table, yes,
the water table, EPA concluded this is not a problem. Now, can you have problems with the inadequate casing? Yes, but that is in the vertical part of the well, and that's always been an issue, right? The vertical casing has to be constructed in a certain way to protect the water table.
You have to follow protocols.
Yeah, and there's no evidence that that can't be done. I do think you can have a lot of industrial activity, a lot of trucks. And the way a fracking site works is there's a lot of activity for a few months, and then everybody goes away, and there's just a wellhead there. I mean, just a Christmas tree, what we call. And I think the companies have gotten much better at engaging with the local communities. If you like, the social contract, figure out, okay, what are you worried about? How can we change our operations so we have less movement of trucks and material? Can we do more recycling of the water? So it's very important in any assessment of fracking, the technology on the environmental side has also not been static. And I would say it's gotten a lot better. There are technologies out there on waterless fracking, maybe using natural gas. There's a lot of things going on. The application of AI to make it much more efficient. So on balance, yes, it is an industrial activity, right? There is going to be noise.
So it is disruptive.
It
yes.
can be disruptive, but It's also possible to work with the communities, and these communities, in many cases, benefit enormously. I always point out, there's an oil well on the campus of the University of Texas. Nobody on the campus is telling them to stop drilling.
All right. Well, okay. So let's say that if proper safeguards are employed and people follow, established best practices, it is as safe as anything else. I mean,
Exactly.
the construction business, has been around for a few thousand years, and we do have accidents on construction sites, right?
We have industrial accidents.
So let's keep this, in perspective. One important point is, however, is water, especially not so much in some parts of the United States like Pennsylvania, where there's plenty of water. But say if you go to Colorado or New Mexico, these other places where water is really an issue. The large consumption of water for fracking, is that an issue?
I think that is an issue, but it gets priced, and I think the new technologies to recycle this water.
Can we do that?
Yes.
We can recycle
it's
fracked
already
water.
happening in many fields. Second, the ability to use brackish instead of fresh water is really coming into its own right now as well.
Okay.
So
You're not competing with agriculture or human consumption and all
it's,
that.
I mean, we spend probably more money watering golf courses than fracking. So.
That's an interesting juxtaposition. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room here, which is renewable energy. Because obviously renewable energy is, it's many things. It's alternative ways of producing mostly electricity, but it's also become a little bit of a theology. That we believe in renewable energy because oil and gas and coal, it's like demonic stuff that is going to destroy the planet and everything. So there are different levels of the argument. Let's embrace the good ones. Let's say fossil fuels, we know them, we've been using them, we've been using them for power generation, for transportation, et cetera, for about 100 years now, or give or take. Well, if we go back to coal and steam, it's a lot more than that. It's time that we find something else that doesn't pollute and this and that. And so we have now new technologies. What everybody knows is solar and wind. I mean, there's others, but these are the best known ones. Give us your take. I mean, this stuff is around, and it's being used.
So the first thing is, no technology comes without some kind of second-order problems or costs. It takes a mass amount of steel and energy to produce all the equipment to install a windmill, which has a relatively short life, 20 or 30 years or something like that, even less. Has to have a lot of repairs.
That's your pylon.
Yeah, your pylons. It's a massive amount of fossil fuels. You would not be able to have wind energy without fossil fuels because you have to make all that stuff. Most automobiles, of their total lifetime emissions, their total lifetime carbon emissions, at least half of those emissions are just in the production of the car. If you want to produce enough lithium to produce a 1,000-pound battery, you must produce 500,000 pounds of mining waste.
Yes.
Mining waste. Much of this mining waste is taking place in parts of the world with child labor and, I would say, less than adequate environmental controls. So I'm not saying these aren't good ideas. They can be extremely efficient and effective, and they can make a big difference. But we have to keep it in perspective. There's not something. I know everyone is looking for a new substance called unobtainium. And unobtainium costs nothing to produce, generates no emissions, and is available everywhere in the world. Well, we don't have that yet.
Unobtainium. I like that. Well, maybe we can start a research project on unobtainium. So not obtainable. All right, but so let's look at this, because as I said, this is obviously it's a technological and scientific issue, but it's also largely now a political issue, because we are all concerned, and I think reasonable people should be concerned about the long-term impact of emissions. And but the question is, first of all, how severe is all this, and what are the best policies to either, mitigate the impact of global warming. And some people, no, what about mitigation? No, we got to reverse this. We got to stop it, and then since it's already too high, we have to reverse it. And chapter 1 of this story is stop using fossil fuels and massively move to renewable energy, the ones that we have, like we just mentioned.
Well, okay.
Does that make sense?
Of course, it doesn't make sense because let's just back up a second. The North American production platform, that's U.S., Canada, Mexico together, is worth $1 trillion. It employs a massive number of people.
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels. I'm talking oil and gas here.
All right.
It's a force of stability in the world oil market, right? It's an important strategic asset for the U.S. And so we're talking now that we're going to transform the national economy away from this $1 trillion platform. And we're going to do it at low cost, right? Well, that might be okay. That one might be. If we could do that at low cost, or let's say a modest carbon tax would rapidly transition the economy. But in fact, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is these alternatives can make enormous inroads in some areas, and we should get on the gradient. Maybe we should have a carbon tax or something reasonable to move along a pathway.
Yeah, people like George Shultz and James Baker have talked about.
That's all reasonable stuff, but people are not interested in that right now. Politics are. We had the former Vice President Biden say he thought we could get rid of fossil fuels in 10 to 12 years. I mean, it's just a ridiculous idea. It's not going to happen. And by the way, it's not about the U.S. It's not even about Europe. It's about India and China and all the economic tigers in Asia, which are growing rapidly, which want all the lifestyles we have here in the sort of modern industrial world. And to think that they are about to give up on all of those.
And also, it's not practical.
It's just not practical. It's not going to happen.
I mean,
we cannot even get India. We cannot even get India to say, look, you should have a program to move away from coal.
Which is about what, about 50%, 60%
of
their...
yeah, and in their power sector. Now, gas growth is happening in India, but it's mostly in the industrial and in the residential communities. They are not giving up on coal.
So let's say that it is not something we should look into. In other words, okay, let's take it from a different angle. How serious is, and I know there are different schools of thought here, and some are, as I said earlier, border on the theological as opposed to the scientific, but we know that temperatures are rising, maybe not in a linear sense, but it's going up and down, but mostly up, it seems. And the concentrations, measurable concentrations, I mean, as a layperson understand of CO2, are rising. When does this become a crisis?
So the part of the problem with this stuff is that all of the work is not really what would I call a scientific experiment, but a model, right? We run these big models. And there's an old adage in my business, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so what's useful about the models is that, and we have to keep our minds open that we might be wrong about the consequences. We might be overestimating, we might be underestimating them. So given this kind of risk profile, what kind of strategy is robust against this uncertainty? I personally think that the value of economic growth, of wealth creation, will give us the tools to make the investment and to adapt. I think that's a common sense way to proceed. But some people disagree with that. Right? Say, to follow up on your point, no, we need a crash program. Not just a crash program. Even if we have to impoverish ourselves, we should do it because we're going to save mankind. But there's no evidence that the consequences of these shifts in climate are going to be the end of the world, right? And if you dig through the research, there's enormous uncertainty. Even the IPCC, the UN body responsible for these big collective reports, has been very, very cautious about extreme kinds of conclusions.
But, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, whenever you read about a major natural disaster, whether it's a forest fire in California or in Greece for that matter. Global warming, that's
Yeah.
it. You know,
So-
there you go. How much more do we need to wait in order to understand,
I got you.
get the point?
So-
That's what people say.
So the Pelkey, the only study I've seen, Pelkey and 3 colleagues. By the way, Pelkey is not a global warming denier. I want to point that out. He is very much thinks that climate change is an anthropomorphic, it's a man-made thing.
Event.
He did a very extensive peer-reviewed study out by NCAR, the National Climate, the big Colorado lab funded by the government. They looked at all the hurricane data, and they could find no evidence that extreme weather events, at least in terms of hurricanes, that the frequency had changed. I actually personally flew with the hurricane hunters in the Navy, but that was a long time ago. We had some big hurricanes hit Florida, but nobody lived there.
Mhm.
So
That's a difference.
you
yes.
must adjust these estimates of damages. Fires in California. I think most of the data suggests this is not that unusual. California is a very arid climate. I used to have massive fires in California. Part of this is, believe it or not, Trump is somewhat correct, bad forest management.
Yes.
If you don't allow the logging and the clearing of the forest, you
When
provide
something-
a lot of brush. So I'm not saying we are not experiencing change in climate. I think you can make the case we are. What I'm saying is it's not the end of the world, and that we should be very careful how much economic growth we give up in order to do something whose payoff may be less than we think.
But in terms of the drivers of innovation when it comes to energy, right? We have a Department of Energy, right? We have federal labs, of course, although they were born for completely different purposes, to do research on nuclear weapons and other things, but now they morphed into kind
We
of
have Renewable Lab out in Colorado.
we got all kinds of
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
In other words, are we, in your, as a professional, as an expert in the field, do you think we should be doing more? Whether it's the federal government or the private sector or universities or what have you, that we should be more aggressive in pursuing alternatives or improving on the cost effectiveness of the renewables that we have right now, which is mostly wind and solar?
So I'm kind of in the Bill Gates camp on this. Yes, we probably should do more. We should do it more intelligently, and that we should have a system that allows for competitive alternatives to gain access. And that may mean, we have to structure the way we do some of these markets, these power markets, differently. On the other hand, we shouldn't fool ourselves. Right now, people are fascinated with electric cars. Right? They think electric cars are the answer. But the point is, electric cars are still more expensive. You need to make them, they have actually some great driving characteristics, but they also have downsides, right? Optionality in terms of, convenience.
But let's talk about that for a moment. Tesla, of course, everybody knows Tesla. And by the way, here in Washington, D.C., where we are, we see quite a few on the roads. Maybe this has to do with the average income in this area, because they're pricey. But so Tesla seemed to be for a moment, okay, this is it, right? Game changer. Now we're going to have affordable, all-electric vehicles, which, by the way, also happen to be beautiful and well-designed and technological gizmos. And yet, as I understand it, Tesla has never turned a profit as of now. Is there, whether it's Tesla or someone else, of course it doesn't matter, going forward, are there constraints? In other words, is this a bad business model because Mr. Elon Musk, the founder, just didn't get it right, or because there are intrinsic constraints that make it impossible, given the cost of the battery and the components,
I think
to
it's
make a profit on
first,
electric
if
vehicles
you-
for the time being?
If you drive a Tesla, it's a fantastic car. But let's be honest, it's very expensive for the average consumer in the U.S., right?
Even the new model that's supposed to be
new model in the
priced
US.
at
Look, I
$35,000?
remember out in Aspen when a very famous, well-known engineer from Toyota said, "Hey, what are you guys talking about? I need to produce a car for $25,000 that I can put a car seat in the back, okay? So when you can do that, come and see me." And the point is that there is a market for electric cars. But there's also something called attribution substitution. If you take a look at the average family that owns a Tesla, they also have a very big SUV, almost all of them. And the average income of these families for a while was over $500,000. It's dropped a bit. There's cheaper models that come in, but this is a niche market. There's no evidence for me. We still don't have more than 1% of sales of electric cars in the U.S.
Yeah, and I would say that at that level of income, if you buy a Tesla, it's not because you want to save money on gas, right?
Exactly.
I don't think that's a major.
And actually, we've done some interesting papers on this, including looking at octane, a lot of things, and that when gasoline prices fell, even hybrid sales dropped like a stone. So American consumers are very sensitive to price. Maybe not in Washington, D.C., where everyone has and people make a lot of money, and there's we don't really work for a living in many ways like the rest of the country. But the point is, I don't think they're quite competitive enough. I think the electric cars will be a growth area, that we'll see a lot more of them. They make a lot of sense in some urban environments, but they still are, in my view, not cost competitive.
So who knows? Again, there may be obviously improvements in technology. If somebody comes up with a small battery that costs $2,000, I mean, then we are in a different universe, right?
Exactly.
But we're not there yet.
Right. And
so
certain aspects of physics make that very difficult.
Let me jump back for a moment about supply, and we haven't really talked at all about nuclear, right? Which is, of course, in a place, well, I guess technically a renewable source, but of a different kind, and an old one that we've been having and we've been using, for decades. Still today, I think, although it's diminishing a bit, our electrical supply is about 20% coming from nuclear, but it's not. It's just too many problems, it seems right now, to become a viable, cost-effective alternative to fossil fuels. Why is that?
So in the end, we're not able to produce these things, I used to do this sort of work, but then there's lots of kind of issues with the entire supply chain and the way they're built and the way they're regulated that makes it very difficult to put a big monster nuclear power plant and get 4 or 5 cents at the bus bar, right, a kilowatt hour. And then if you look at the current ones that are being built, I think we've got one left in the U.S. under construction. That's going to come in around. It's not so much that it comes in around 12 cents a kilowatt hour, or 50, whatever the number is. It's that it's a huge financial risk. So you have to spend, $10, $15 billion. You have
upfront,
and you have to wait 10 to 12 years to
cover those costs.
I can put up a combined cycle natural gas power plant, right, in 18 months, and probably deliver power at 4 to 5 cents at the bus bar. So from a risk point of view, on the other hand, the nukes they're fascinating in the sense that you turn them on and they run forever. They give you enormous, stable base load. So there should be a role for nuclear power. But I just think a combination of the technology and our politics and the regulatory framework has killed it.
Whoever's going to build them, just the insurance cost.
You have the ratepayers. The ratepayers have to pay for it. That's the problem.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. So that's not. It doesn't look like mainstream.
Doesn't look good for the U.S. I think the French can do it. I don't like this.
The Koreans seem to be.
The Koreans can do it. I think the Chinese can do it. They'll probably do it. Yeah.
Okay, so somebody else, but not us. So here we go. So we go kind of lights and shadows here. So the bright stuff here is that we got a lot of power, in the U.S., which we didn't really think we would have at this time 10, 15 years ago if we were having the same conversation. The downside is, pollution. But again, we cannot measure it exactly in its actual impact.
So when we use the word pollution, let's be careful. All the major criteria pollutants in the U.S., sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, lead, soot, PM2 or particulates are way down. In fact, let me just give you an example. a 1968 Mustang, of the one driven by Steve McQueen in the iconic movie Bullitt.
Yes.
That had about 1,500 to 1 ton of criteria pollutants over 100,000 miles. The 2016 Mustang, looks pretty similar in many ways, has 10 pounds over 100,000 miles. So the notion that the technology has gotten enormously
Better.
There's no doubt. It's almost nothing, right? So then people are talking about carbon as a pollution. But it's hard to think about CO2 as a pollutant, right? It's not a criteria pollutant. It is a natural phenomena in the earth in which the models are saying might lead to climate change or will lead to, depends who you talk to, will lead to climate change. But it's not a criteria pollutant in the sense that it affects local,
it doesn't
local
affect
air
your
quality.
lungs.
There's nothing in the Clean Air Act, really. I mean, they've sort of horseshoed something into it with the sort of Supreme Court ruling and things, although the people forget the Clean Power Plan was stayed by the Supreme Court. That EPA tried to go outside the perimeter of the power plants to get the CO2 limits to work. So that's still going to be settled in the courts over time. But I just think that CO2 is a different animal than criteria pollutants. It's hard to argue it's a pollutant. You might ask that's a greenhouse gas or that's changing.
Okay. So fair enough. But so let's say that this is an issue and it will continue to be debated. And of course, we haven't even touched on the Green New Deal, which is the kind of the how can I say, the heavenly solution to all our problems, not just about environment, but also social justice and jobs and equality and everything. Well, maybe this is for another conversation. So let's say that, with some caution, as we all should have, there's the optimistic side of increased energy production, that we are working on different sources of energy. And I guess for all of us, energy is energy, right? If as long as it's cost effective, and if somebody shows me something that is more cost effective than gas, why not?
Right. I think
or oil or whatever,
And there may be some merit to some kind of carbon tax and stuff, but think about the carbon tax. With all the other interest groups on the environmental side, would they be willing to give up all the regulatory? Because I think that's the appeal for people who may be less enthusiastic about it. Right? They say, okay, you're going to put a $50 a ton or $80 a ton tax on carbon. I might be interested in that as a businessman or a political interest. Are you going to get rid of all the regulatory stuff on carbon? If you get rid of the regulatory stuff where we're going to have a true kind of market, well, I might be interested. But I don't think the environmentalists are interested. They want the tax and they want the command and control.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, on that note, there's plenty more to talk about, but let's leave it for another conversation.
Absolutely.
So this has been a fascinating discussion with our good friend Lou here. Lou Pugliaresi, who is currently the president of the Energy Policy Research Foundation here in Washington, D.C. We'll be talking about gas and oil and renewables and Tesla and electric cars and LNG and a lot more. Thank you, Lou, for your expertise.
Thank you,
and
Paolo.
we'll be talking again soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.